Gentlemen, how are you? Okay, so where we were yesterday is that the Sefer brought from another Sefer who wished to defend a person who exaggerates the number of students in the yeshiva in order to try to persuade people to give more money, to be more supportive of the yeshiva. And he basically quoted, the Sefer quoted from the Shulchan Aruch, where it says that it's permitted for a Gabbai Tzedakah to borrow money from the community fund so that he can say there's no money left in the fund. In other words, there may be $10,000 left in the fund to distribute to the poor, but if I try to raise money when I already have a surplus, it's not a very successful fundraising endeavor. Like you pointed out, Moish, right? You don't want to tell people that the mortgage is covered, right? You want to tell people that we're down to our last $10 in the bank account. So that's a more effective fundraising technique. So if you're permitted to do that, the Shulchan Aruch says the Gabbai is permitted to borrow the money. In other words, he can't lie. If there is money in the fund, there's money in the bank, you can't lie and say there's no more money. But what you can do, according to the Shulchan Aruch, is borrow the money, you transfer it into your account or use it for whatever you need it for. Tell people now that the fund is depleted and use that to fundraise. So doesn't that seem to imply that you're allowed to use deceptive practices to raise money for tzedakah? He says, Ulam yesh lefakfek al rayaso. He says, it's not such a good raya, however. He says, because shaharei betaz chasav zelashono kidei la'asos perish lachuf la'acherim ad kam lashono. He says, you're allowed to use this tactic in order to coerce people to give tzedakah. Dahainu da'asinu lamidin kfiyah. He says, clearly the context, according to the way the Taz understands this halacha, is that we're dealing with a system whereby we're allowed to tax members of the community and forcefully coerce them to give tzedakah as part of a tax that for living in this village. V'imkein mistaber shemeduber ba'ofen shayamuter lachuv chagon shelo hayu nosnim ma shehischayvu kvar laseis lebeis hakneses. So we're talking about a situation where a person had not paid yet his tax that he owes for the synagogue, the mikveh, etc. V'imkein ein lameidim mikan ela shekeshemutar lachuf az mutar lachuf barama gamkein. All we see from that halacha, therefore, that's the way you're going to learn that sif in Shulchan Aruch, is that when it's permitted to coerce people, you can coerce using deceit. In other words, if a person says, I'm not paying my membership, the shul is in the black and it doesn't need my money, so why should I pay my membership? So then you could say, no, the shul doesn't have money. And here, I'll prove it to you. Look at our bank account. We're down to our last $100 and we need to meet payroll. Only then can you say to a person, you're a member of the shul and you haven't paid your membership. Now you have to pay up. And even in that scenario, you're not allowed to lie because it doesn't fall under the rubric of those situations that are described in the Gemara and Bava Metzia where you are permitted to lie, where you're allowed to say, for example, I didn't sleep in that bed like we talked about yesterday. And that's why we require the Gabbai Tzedakah to actually borrow the money out of the fund so that it will turn out that he's not lying. So there's two differences between that case and our case of lying about the number of students in the yeshiva. Number one, when there's only 100 students and you say there's 500, you're actually lying. This is not using a deceitful tactic. This is actually a lie. And there's no heter to lie in this situation. Number two, there's no This is not comparable to a situation where a person is benefiting from, let's say, the synagogue services and is not paying his membership that he owes. This is purely a voluntary donation where a person is giving, let's say, $1,000 and you want to persuade him to give $10,000 instead. It says there's nothing that can be comparable to the situation described in the Shulchan Aruch over there. And he says, furthermore, va'od afilu tim salomar shalom medubar she's chayvu kvar lases. He says, even if you won't learn like the Taz, that it's a scenario over there where the person is not obligated to pay his membership. Mikol makom yesh lefakfek al rayaso di yitachen delo medubar sham ba'ofen shagabai goram sheyitnu hatzibur yoser mimasho yenosim ilu yadu es ha'emes. He says, but still, the case in the Shulchan Aruch is Ditachen Delo Medubar Sham Ba'ofen. Maybe it's talking about over there. Delo Medubar Sham Ba'ofen Shagabai Goram Sheyitnu Atzibur Yoser. It's not talking about a case where through the Gabai's misinformation, he's causing people to give more. Elamashma Shahatzibur Hayu Misatzlam Lahavias Trumoseim. V'hagabai be'etzem enu elo mizaris v'lo chetzosam kedei sheyitnu mashim hayu nostem me'atzmim b'chol mikra. But maybe the case over there is that people were just being lazy. They said, come back tomorrow, I'll give you tomorrow. And the Gabbai says, no, we need it today. Well, why do you need it today? Because look, the coffers are empty. In other words, it could very well be that the only right that you have to represent that the fund is empty when it's really, when you just because you've borrowed from the fund, is only when people would have been giving anyway the same amount, just they would have not have as quick to give, because they said, listen, you have plenty of money, come back to me next month. So maybe only in that situation where you're not extracting more do you have a right to say, well, the coffers are empty, and then you actually make the coffers empty. The bottom line is that you have no proof from that case in the Shulchan Aruch that you can extrapolate that to a case where you're actually going to misrepresent a Jewish institution's influence and scope of services in order to be able to persuade people to give more than what a person would normally have given had he known it was a very small organization. Okay, so that was the first siman. Second siman, the Inyan Kabbalas Tzedakah Minashim. This is now going on to another shaila, which is related to what we had seen before. Is it ever permitted to accept tzedakah from women? We've seen this halacha. We learned about this in Imrei Yaakov, and we learned a little bit about this in this Sefer Hilchos Tzedakah. Is it ha'imuter lekabel miisha nesua sikum katan kegon shekel? So first of all, can you accept a small donation from a married woman? Umahadin legabi sikum shel chamisha shkalim. How about 5 shekels? In other words, at what point, remember we saw you're allowed to accept small donations from women, from married women, where you can assess that the husband won't mind. But larger donations you should not accept from married women because you don't know whether she has been granted permission to take her husband's money and give it for tzedakah. Ha'im mutar lekabel mimena sikum gadol kegon 50 shkalim. V'ha'im hi ne'emenet lomar shebala marshela. What about 50 shekels? And, which is already now a more significant amount of money. And furthermore, what if a woman tells you, I'm giving you 100 shekels, but my husband gave me permission? So tshuva. So the response is, Bizmanenu kishe'eno yodea matzav ashirut shel habal mutar lekabel shekel osikum kadan domeh meisha nesua ki min hastam kol bal marshel ishto latet sikum kazeh. When you know nothing about the situation in a family dynamic, and all you know is that this woman is married, you're allowed to accept a small donation from her, such as a shekel, $1, because we can assume that the husband doesn't mind if she gives that small amount. Now, he says, but legabe sikum gadol mizeh, shelo kol bal marsheh liishto latet litzdaka. But he says that once the amount gets a little bit larger, where maybe a husband wouldn't be so quick to allow his wives, let's say 5 shekels. Now, obviously, this is all subjective. It depends on the economic status of the people and so forth. Kevin shesikum kazeh enu nechshav lesikum gadol, v'zeh davar matzui lateit sikum kazeh litzdaka. He says, but even 5 shekels is not a large amount. And it's very common for people to give 5 shekels to tzedakah. Va'od she'en lanu lachzik nashim kiganavot. And furthermore, there's no reason to assume that a woman is a ganav. He says there's only a suspicion that maybe the husband wouldn't want her to give that much. But there too, you're allowed to assume that she received permission from her husband and her husband's okay with it. But once you get into higher amounts, let's say like 50 shekel, he says this gets into a larger suffix because, it's the person, because the shaila is addressed to the fundraiser. Guy goes and raises money from the woman of the house, because he knocks on the door. The woman answers the door, and he tells her he's here to collect tzedakah. He's faced with a dilemma: is he allowed to give? Now, if the woman has not received permission from her husband, then she also has a shaila. Am I allowed to take my husband's money? That was the first shaila that we had, that a woman is not allowed to go behind her husband's back and take money, even if she feels she's doing him a favor by tithing his money. She's not allowed to go behind his back and do that. Now the question is, what if I don't know anything about the relationship between the husband and the wife? Am I allowed to take tzedakah from her? Small amounts, yes, because there's a greater preponderance of likelihood that the husband is totally fine. But once you get into larger amounts, and that's a subjective, we don't really have a fixed amount. It all depends on the economic bracket. You wouldn't be allowed to take. And that's all stam, meaning that she hasn't related at all whether her husband knows about this or not. But if she says explicitly, you say to her, well, madam, 50 shekels, that's quite a large sum. That's very generous of you. I hope your husband is okay with this. Does he know that you give such large amounts? Yeah. And then after she accuses you of being a misogynist, or a patronizing or whatever she's going to accuse you of. Yeah, I think that would change the scenario. If it has her name on the account and only her name, then I think that makes a huge difference. What if it has both of their names? Not necessarily all of her property. Only the property she brought with her into the marriage that was unqualified property. But let's say her father gives her a piece of property after she's already married, and explicitly conditions with her that this is yours on the condition that your husband has no rights to it. So a father or any other testator has a right to do that. A woman could become very wealthy as long as it's not property she brings with her at the time of the marriage. Or you could also have a scenario where she delineates all of the property she's bringing into the marriage at the writing of the ketubah, and then the husband acknowledges, but I don't have any rights to property X, Y, and Z. Yes, right. And that's the thing, is that the fundraiser has no knowledge of any of this, right? So, but basically what he's saying is that when the fundraiser has no knowledge, if it's a large amount, you have to sort of be suspicious, and you have to say, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to accept this from you if this is from your husband's bank account. And if she says, don't worry, it's my money, it's my private stash, my knippel, right? Well, this is what the word I learned from my wife. You've heard of that term knippel, right? I told you about that. So she says, it's my private stash. I think all Hungarian women have a knippel. Or if she tells you my husband is fine with this, he's authorized me to be in charge of his tzedakah, so then you are allowed to accept it. Yeah, prenuptial agreements, that's what a ketubah is. It's a prenuptial agreement.
No, what I meant is that the husband doesn't get as on the property.
Correct. The standard agreement without any qualification is that the husband has rights to all of her property that she brings into the marriage. And there's two types of property. The chattel becomes his outright, but he owes it back to her in dollars. Like it's liquidated mentally into a cash value. So in other words, our ketubas don't say these things explicitly, but it's implicit. But it used to be recorded explicitly that if a girl came from a wealthy family, it would say right there in the ketubah, it would say, Rachel bat Yaakov is bringing into the marriage $100,000 worth of commodities, right? Which is worth $100,000. And that's her nichsei tzon barzel, which means it's that money upon termination of the marriage is owed to her from the estate of her husband, because basically it's given to him as a loan. It's on loan to his estate until such time that he dies or divorces her, right? It's only if she predeceases him that he gets that money and he inherits her, right? And then there's nichsei milug, which is her real estate. And you would itemize the real estate that she brings into the marriage, where the husband doesn't become the owner of the real estate, but he becomes the active controller of that real estate and can do with the real estate whatever he wants. But yeah, and he can live off the dividends of the payros of that property until such time that the marriage terminates, and then the property is returned back to her. But her name was always on the title. Okay, so it's a pretty good deal to marry a rich girl. Someone in my family who told their kids to marry rich. That's just what they.
Women could be vulnerable to fundraisers in situations. So, is there any role the poor would play in this? Because it's also his inheritance that may be given away too.
Well, it all depends. I mean, this goes back to the will document. Remember, we learned about wills, and basically nowadays, the woman becomes the heir of her husband. A woman inherits her husband because of the wishes of the husband in his will documents, even though that goes contrary to the instructions made by the Torah. You're allowed to do that. You're allowed to circumvent Torah law as far as inheritance. If a man says, I want my wife to be the one who owns my estate upon my death, so it's her money, and therefore the Bechor does not play a role. Now, we all look at this kind of scenario. Look, I look at my mom, and what were to happen if someone conniving were to get a hold of her and get to her at a vulnerable moment and convince her to give a whole bunch of money to his charity, depleting the estate. It happens all the time. Someone in the shul just told me that he has an aunt in New York, and there's a rabbi that he's apparently a guy that I know, who he has suggested as taking advantage of his 90-something-year-old aunt. and is trying to get his hands on her estate. So what do you do in that situation? There is no, I am not aware of any halachic provision that can protect someone in that situation. I really don't know of a halachic provision. And maybe that's worthwhile researching, but there's secular provisions of getting, what's it called, an elder abuse lawyer or something like that? There is something called elder abuse, where if you can demonstrate that an elderly, a senior citizen is being exploited or being mistreated, then you can do something about it. But I don't know. I mean, you'd have to be able to demonstrate halachically that a senior has the status of a shota, of a person of unsound mind, in order to be able to prevent a person from being able to give away their money, right? And that's not so easy to do. I think it's harder to demonstrate from a halachic standpoint. Okay. So I don't think we're going to do the bottom part of this halacha, because we've already spent time on this. So I want to rather go to the next siman. Let's see. So we're going to skip to the next question, which also has to do with accepting tzedakah from women. Shimon she'ela as follows. Shimon mevaker midei pam etzel horav. Shimon visits his parents from time to time. V'lifamim imo notenet lo sikum shel kesef la'azor lo. And from time to time, his mother gives him money. She gives him some cash to help him out. V'hi mevakeshet mimenu shelo l'saper zot la'aviv. And she says, don't tell dad. Uv'sha'a hamat'ima hi mesaperet la'aviv ma sha'asta. V'hi yodad sha'az hu yismach. And after Shimon leaves, she says, don't worry. I just need to find an opportune time to tell your father. He'll be fine with it. But right now, I think it had to do with the fact that you and dad got into a little bit of a tizzy. You know how sometimes fathers and sons can get into it. He says, here's some cash. Don't tell dad. But don't worry, I'll tell him later. He'll be fine. And we know, based on the circumstances, that if she were to ask him at the time when she's giving her son Shimon the money, the father would refuse. So, Ha'im Shimon Rashai Lekabel Mi'imo et Kaspei HaTzedakah. Does Shimon have a right to accept the money from his mother? Now, it's assuming that Shimon is a worthy recipient of tzedakah. Is he a worthy recipient, or does the mother just want to give him a gift? He doesn't qualify that, because he's probably thinking in the context of his world, where they're living in Beitar or what is it called, Kiryat Sefer, and everyone's poor and needs a little bit of help because we're learning in Kollel. And so he goes to visit mom and dad, and mom gives him some cash, but she says, don't tell dad. I don't think he's going to be too happy. He's been bugging you to get a job for the last 5 years, and you keep insisting you want to stay and learning. So don't tell dad I gave you the money, but don't worry. Right? Okay, you can certainly imagine the scenario, right? So he says, Techila yesh lahakdim, sheyesh poskim shekasvu shein lakachas mamun chaver lo reshuso. Afilu yodeya shechaver yismach kisheyedazos. So the first thing is that you need to know is that there are poskim who say that you're not allowed to take your friend's money without his knowledge, without his permission, even if you know that when he discovers after the fact that he'll be fine that you took his money, nonetheless, you're not allowed to take it without his express permission. Ba'ashach kasav, shafilu lechatchila muter lekachat mechaver al smach zeh shelabasav chaver yismach. Now the Shach says it's okay. Shach says you are allowed to take your friend's money without his knowledge, even if you know, specifically because you know that once he discovers that you borrowed from his piggy bank, it's fine. He'll be fine with it, right? In other words, as long as you know that once he discovers that you took the money, he'll be fine. You're allowed to take his money behind his back. Ulam ze b'tanai ilu hayachaver yodea davar ze miikara hayamitratzeh. That's only provided that if he would have known about it at the time that you took the money, he also would have been okay. But everyone, including the shach, would agree that if at the time that you're taking the money, your friend does not want you to take, your friend would not want you to take the money, right? Even though maybe, let's say, in a couple of days, he would be appeased over the fact that you took the money, then that would for sure be usher. That's a form of geneva. Okay? So based upon that, right, so you have a real dilemma. Lefizeh, b'nidon dinan, sheha'ima yodat, she'im tishal et baila im latet kesef livnam, yisarev ha'aba latet kesef leben. So he says, in our situation, the mother knows that if she would tell her husband outright, I'm giving a few $100s to our son Shimon so that he can go back to Kiryat Sefer and buy diapers and stuff like that. And the father would say, nothing doing. I want to squeeze him so that he'll go out and leave Kollel and get a job. And they would get into a big fight. So she decides instead to give it to her son quietly without the husband's knowledge. So you see, in that circumstance, the father would not, had he known that the wife was giving the money, the father would not be happy. It would therefore be usher for Ima to give the money to Shimon according to any posek, right? Behind her husband's back. And if she tries to shtup him with money on his way out the door, as she's walking him to the car, she says, "Shh, don't say anything. Take this." Right? I once saw a comedian who always said, a Jewish comedian, he always said, my father always used to give me the money quietly, like he would stick it in my pocket. I couldn't understand why. Why do you have to give it quietly? Right? But sometimes you do have to give it quietly. Right? She sticks it in his pocket. She says, don't tell Abba, but don't worry, I'll tell him afterwards. So that kind of scenario, that's not permitted. And even the shach would agree. Kimashi hitir hashach hurak kasher yodim anachnu kasher ha'av yishmahu yitratzeh meikara. He says because the only time the shach gives a heter to take someone's money without their knowledge is if you know for a fact that if the guy would know about it right now, he would be fine with it. But if you think that he would be unhappy with it at the time of the taking of the money, and it's only that we'd have to convince him and appease him so that he'll be happy later, then even the shach would agree that it's aser. The kan lamrot sheyadu leben shahav lebasof yismach mikol makom kevin demiikara lo hayahav mitratzeh asur lekule alma. And therefore, in our scenario, everyone would agree that it's aser to take the money from Ima, even if she sticks it in your pocket. You have to say, Ima, I cannot take this. Daddy, Abba does not know about this, and I know that he's not happy that I'm still in Kollel, and I know that he's not happy that I don't have money, so I can't take the money from you unless we get express permission from Abba. Do you want me to ask Abba if I can take the money? She says, no, it's going to pay too much machloikas. All right, come back next Tuesday. By then I'll convince him, right? So let's go to the biurim. Let's just see the commentary over here. Yeah. It depends. It depends on how the marriage is structured, right? In other words, really technically, according to halacha, any money that a woman makes belongs to her husband, according to the halacha. If, however, the husband gives permission expressly to his wife and says, whatever you make from your business or whatever you're doing, you can keep in a separate account. I don't want to have any access to that money. And he tells her that expressly. And I don't know whether halacha would require you to draw up an express contract. I think just as long as there's a verbal agreement between them, then she could give from her stash whatever she likes. Like, I know that my wife has been given cash in the past from her parents, or from her aunt, let's say, where her aunt will tell her, darling, don't tell your husband, I want you to buy yourself something with this money, right? And I'm totally fine with it. I couldn't care less, right? And it's funny because, you know, sometimes a woman might have sort of like this apprehension, like recently a man gave that there's a man that we know was a congregant of ours in California, and my wife sometimes gives him therapeutic counseling on the phone, because they've known each other for so many years. He's an older man, so every once in a while he'll give her a check, he'll send her a check, and I've told her, I said, that money's yours. I don't want to have anything to do with it. Is it okay if I deposit the check in our account? But just, you know, you'll take the money, you do with it whatever you want. So, you know, anyway, so she wanted to make sure that that she had access to the funds. I said, absolutely, just take one whenever you want, just take them. Anyway, so we'll hold it here. We'll look at the Biurim tomorrow. Okay.